Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy, coming to you live from Moscow, Idaho. We are at the Moscow Police Department, where they have been investigating the murders of those 4 University of Idaho students since November 13th. A suspect is now in custody. 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger is charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary for the November 13th homicides, where Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle were senselessly murdered in a home off of campus. It stunned this community and really stunned the nation. And there were a lot of people wanting this killer caught, wondering when it would happen. And last Friday, Moscow police said they got their man. Bryan Kohberger is expected to appear in a Monroe County courtroom in Pennsylvania later this afternoon, where he will waive extradition and then be brought back to Idaho to answer to those murder charges. Through his attorney, he has said that he hopes to be exonerated. He claims that he is innocent of these charges. Bryan Kohberger lived just a short distance away from Moscow, Idaho, about 10 miles away. He was a graduate student getting his PhD in criminology and criminal justice at Washington State University. I spoke with Shannon Gray. He is the attorney for the Gonsalves family. Spoke with him about what the family is looking for as we move forward from the investigation, which is ongoing, to now a prosecution.
I mean, I don't know if anything's really, that's not really what we're focused on right now. I mean, what we're focused on now is moving forward and hoping that they have done a proper investigation for a conviction. And so that's the key. Obviously, giving us a phone call immediately when the person was being taken into custody was the right thing to do. And so we're hoping that we'll continue to get more information ahead of time moving forward. That's our hope. I mean, they don't need to, I mean, they haven't reached out to us to set up a meeting or anything. I'm obviously a criminal defense attorney myself and a former prosecutor. So I've explained to them how the process goes and what the hearings might entail and how that's going to be playing out and how we'll just kind of take it day by day. Everyone thinks that I think that he's going to get back here and he's going to automatically be arraigned on the case, and that's just not what's going to happen. His first appearance will probably be getting an attorney. So get either a court-appointed attorney, or if someone if the family hires an attorney, a privately retained attorney, and then that attorney's going to want a couple of days to talk with his client, and then they'll have the preliminary hearing regarding the probable cause for the arrest, and then obviously the Latah County will have to get a grand jury. That's for the indictment, and he can be arraigned on an information prior to the indictment and be held on that. And then, so I mean, there's a lot of moving process things that are going on that aren't going to happen immediately on the case. So.
And that was attorney Shannon Gray, who's been representing the family of Kaylee Gonsalves, saying the family is relieved by this arrest, but obviously their daughter was senselessly murdered, and they are looking for justice, still missing their daughter, of course, and grieving as a family. Joining me today to discuss this case and to take all of your questions is Joseph Scott Morgan, and he is a forensic death investigator, also the host of the Body Bags podcast, and Bobby Chacon, a retired FBI agent. Thank you so much to both of you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Joseph, I'll start with you. Yeah. Joseph, I'll start with you on this one. And we are taking viewer questions. We want to let you know that. So submit them on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, in our YouTube chat, anywhere. And Bobby, Joseph, and I will answer all of your questions. Joseph, I'm starting with you on this. I'm wondering, what do you think the police have? And I know this is speculation. There's been some reporting out there that there was DNA evidence in this case that led authorities to Bryan Kohberger to identify him as a suspect. What do you think it was that possibly led to a DNA profile in this case?
Well, if what is being reported is accurate, my estimation, it's going to be a combination of things. First off, they would have found certainly a copious amount of blood at the scene. The question is, was it commingled with the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator's blood, or any other kind of body fluids that might have been left around? You got to keep in mind, blood is not the only source for DNA-rich evidence. Another piece to this is going to be anything that was found on the bodies. And, we go back to the hands being bagged, which is a common practice in my field, to retain any kind of trace evidence. If there was anything contained beneath the fingernails, and we have to keep in mind, that's not simply skin. You can also find blood from a perpetrator beneath the fingernails as they're being raked away. And I think finally, whatever kind of tiebacks there might be in that vehicle, I think the vehicle is huge, because if he had allegedly been in that house and had committed these crimes, and I think admittedly he would have been super saturated in blood, that evidence would have transferred into the car somehow, and not just the blood, but any kind of other trace evidence he's taken away. So they've got this is an evidence-rich environment, and it will have been inoculated with everybody's DNA that was at the scene.
Bobby, we are moving forward in this entire process. The extradition hearing is scheduled for 3:30 Eastern time today, where Bryan Kohberger's attorney told me he will waive extradition so he can come back here to Idaho. The question is, how are they going to get him back here, and how quickly will that happen? What do you see happening?
Well, that's a tough question, because logistically there are a lot of moving parts in this, and each case is handled a little differently. So the only issue in Pennsylvania is he the Bryan Kohberger that's named in the Idaho arrest warrant? That's the only issue. This is not an evidence thing. This is not a guilt thing. It's only the only argument is he the same Bryan? Is he the same person that's named? If he is, he has to go back. So that's why they often waive extradition, because it's only an identity hearing. It's only, are you the same person that's named in the warrant? And almost always they are, right? And so he knows even if he has an extradition hearing, he'll lose and be removed. But he'll waive extradition. They'll have that hearing. There'll be an order to remove him from the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania, and then the detectives will either get him on a bus or get him on a plane and fly him back to Idaho, whereas you heard the family attorney say he'll have an initial appearance where he'll get an attorney assigned to him, either a public defender or a privately retained counsel, and then that counsel will ask the judge for a few days so he can review the charging instrument that they charged him with. Now, there are 3 charging instruments: an information, a complaint, and an indictment. And so far, he's probably been charged under a complaint or an information, because to get an indictment, you have to see the grand jury. That grand jury has to spend time getting evidence presented to it and then vote on an indictment. So I think that will come later on. But initially, I think they'll put him on a plane. They'll transport him to Idaho, where he'll have that initial hearing, hopefully, maybe later this week, where he'll get his attorney attached, and then the attorney will request some days to review some of the material.
And I should mention, too, that Bobby Ciccone is also an attorney, so he can talk with us about the legal aspects of this, too, what we will see moving forward. We are taking your questions, as I mentioned earlier. Submit them to us on Twitter, Twitch, in our YouTube chat, Facebook. We will get to them as soon as we can. Our first question from Twitter comes from @JusticeBrant. Would be interested to know when the flight ticket was bought for the dad to go to Idaho, before the murder or at the last minute. I'm going to take this question, and then Bobby, I'll ask you about this as well. I had spoken with Jason LaBar, Bryan Kohberger's attorney, on Sunday, and he told me that Bryan Kohberger's father flew from Pennsylvania to Washington to then drive the white Hyundai Elantra back to Pennsylvania. This was a trip, he said, that was planned before the school year started, so they would drive back together for Christmas. So we don't know when that plane ticket was actually purchased, but we do know that it was planned in advance, according to Jason LaBar, the public defender representing Bryan Kohberger in Pennsylvania. But Bobby, I'm going to ask you this. Does when Dad purchased that plane ticket matter at all? The parents have said in a statement that they are cooperating with law enforcement and that they're shocked by this.
It wouldn't matter to me as an investigator. If I was an investigator on this team investigating this homicide, the dad is an ancillary character in this. Some people might think he might be an accessory, but that's not germane to me. If I'm looking to convict someone on these 4 homicides, I'm looking at a person now. I have to focus all my efforts to make sure we can obtain a conviction in court. And so I have to make sure all of that evidence is ripe and proper. And all the white noise of prior bad acts by the defendant or other people that might have helped him. Other teams can start looking at that, but there has to be a focus now because charges have been lodged in murder, and so we want to get a conviction of this guy in murder. If somebody helped him, if the dad was involved, that can sometimes come later. Those are charges that would probably be tried separately anyway, if in fact they do get charged. But right now, the focus of the investigators has to be on this crime scene, these victims, and this suspect, this defendant now in trial.
And that's most certainly what the focus does need to be. And everything we've heard is that the parents, as I said, were shocked by this arrest. We're going to go on to a question now from a Gerst Kitty. And Bobby, I probably should throw this one to you, but I'm interested in what Joseph has to say about it as well. Any chance he decides to represent himself like a Darrell Brooks situation? Of course, we know, Bobby, that this is a criminology PhD student studying criminal justice. Into the criminal mind, he knows how the system works. Do you foresee that at all, that this Bryan Kohberger would try to represent himself?
Well, I mean, look, it's very rare that happens. And yes, we did have the Brooks case this year in which that did happen, or last year now, in which that did happen. And it's fascinating for us always to get that insight because we very rarely ever hear from a defendant in a murder case. They very rarely take the stand and they very rarely represent themselves. Now, that being said, if this guy is such a narcissist that he wants to use this platform to get his voice out there and to get all the attention, then he might choose to do that. Everybody has the right to defend themselves. They have a right to stand up before the court themselves and defend themselves. It's not very advisable, particularly if you're not versed in the law and how a courtroom works and how trials work. So I don't know. I don't see him doing that, but it's always unusual when a defendant does that, but it does happen. I always think it's a mistake when a defendant chooses to do that, and so do most legal people. But it's possible. It depends on what level of narcissism he's currently harboring.
And of course, he maintains his innocence, saying he hopes to be exonerated of this. He has rights just like every other criminal defendant does. And we just saw just in the last 30 seconds or so, there was video that we have from News Nation where they caught Bryan Kohberger being led into the Monroe County courthouse for that extradition hearing. Hours ahead of time, of course. There are security concerns here, so I don't find it unusual that they brought him in so early for that hearing. Joseph, I want to talk to you about just the personality of this guy. I know you're a forensic death investigator. You're looking at clues at the scene. But we've heard some rumors that this was a sloppy scene. We don't know that for certain. But what do you see from this guy? He's a criminology student, a criminal justice major. We know about that survey that was online on Reddit where he was seeking information for research. What are you thinking about Bryan Kohberger as a defendant, what we know about him so far?
Well, I think going back to the earlier comment, the previous question, I think that there's a tie back here. There are people that are out there that are conflating the study of criminology with the study of forensic science. And nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah, we cross paths with behaviorists all the time. However, that doesn't make you an expert in crime scene investigation. As a matter of fact, he probably knows very little at all about the process of working a scene and certainly processing the evidence and what we're specifically looking for when you get down into the details. And this case is all about details. And we're going to look in places that he probably thought about, but some places he didn't think about. And my colleagues that are still actively working in the field will dig deep into this. And this is where they're going to harvest everything from. So, this is the interesting part to this. He can go and he can seek out knowledge in an academic setting, okay? But an academic setting is not an applied setting, all right? So he can go and he can sit and learn at DeSales with my friend Catherine Ramsland. He can sit in her classroom and he can learn from her, certainly, I would imagine. But that doesn't make him a behaviorist. He's just sitting there learning. And how he applies that knowledge is anybody's guess. To my buddy Bobby's comment about being a narcissist, roll the dice, see how it works out for you, because it's not going to work out well for you if you try to represent yourself in this case. And just like I don't think it's worked out well for him if he attempted to make any alterations at that scene or pick up after himself. They're always going to miss something.
Most definitely. They say you leave something everywhere you go. And I think it would be very difficult to enter a scene, to enter any place like that, take part in possibly, something this violent and not leave something behind. We're going to take one last question. This is from Dinky Doug on Twitter. And Dinky Doug is asking, will cameras be allowed? The only thing we know is that cameras are allowed in the hallway. For this proceeding, cameras in the state of Pennsylvania are not allowed in the courtroom, so there will not be any video of this hearing. However, there is a feed being allowed from the courtroom or the courthouse in the hallway, so we will be able to see him enter the courthouse. Also, another question about when he will be brought back here. We just don't know. That question from Ali Puma on Twitter. So we don't know, Ali, but we're thinking it could be fairly soon. That will be kept under wraps for sure, because this is a high-profile case with a high-profile defendant, and safety is a concern. All right, we are going to take a quick break. Keep your questions coming on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, and on our YouTube chat. We'll take all of your questions, or hopefully get to as many of them as we can and answer them. We'll be right back. You are watching The Lunch Show here live from Moscow, Idaho on Law and Crime. Welcome back to the Lunch Show. And welcome back to the Lunch Show here on Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy, coming to you live from Moscow, Idaho. This is where those homicides of the 4 University of Idaho students, Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were committed. And now we have a suspect in custody who is soon to be a criminal defendant. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old Washington State University PhD student studying criminology and criminal justice, is going to waive extradition later today and be brought back to Idaho to answer to 4 first-degree murder charges and a felony burglary charge. He will be formally served with the paperwork, the complaint and the affidavit outlining some of the evidence in this case when he arrives back in Idaho. And at that time, we expect to get more information and hear what is in that affidavit to support those charges. We are taking your questions live here on Law and Crime. Submit them to us on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, and Facebook, and we will answer them. And joining me this hour, here with me still this hour to answer your questions, retired FBI agent Bobby Chacon, who's also an attorney, and Joseph Scott Morgan, who is a forensic death investigator. Bobby, this first question I'm going to send to you, because you're also an attorney. This comes from Stereophonics Mom. Question: chances of him going pro se? We kind of touched on this earlier, but I'm going to combine that with another question from Crypto Man 5000. Shouldn't this case be presented to a federal grand jury? He crossed state lines, etc. So first question, chances of going pro se. Second, should this go to a federal grand jury because he crossed state lines allegedly?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, like we said earlier, every defendant has the right to defend themselves up in court, and that's a basic right that you can exercise. It's not advisable, especially if you're not trained in the legal system. Even when you do represent yourself, as we saw in the Darrell Brooks case, you get assigned an attorney by the court to kind of offer advice and guidance to you if you're representing yourself. Now, the person can either rely on that advice or completely ignore it if they want. And we saw the disastrous effects it had in the Darrell Brooks trial. And so it's never, I mean, to me, it's never advisable to represent yourself unless you have some kind of legal background or understand how the legal system works. Because, you know, we often see this when we watch trials on Law and Crime, that people don't understand why certain things are happening in the courtroom the way they do. And there's reasons for that, but you have to be a trained, you know, lawyer or in the legal field to understand those reasons. And it's really a minefield if you don't have that familiarity with the rules of evidence and things like that, and you can really do yourself a disservice by representing yourself. And so what was the second part of that question, Anjanette?
The second one was, shouldn't this case be presented to a federal grand jury? He crossed state lines, allegedly, you know, coming from Washington to Idaho. So crossing state lines can make something a federal crime.
Well, it can, but I mean, not in this case. This is a local homicide committed, you know, in a local jurisdiction, and the federal nexus of crossing state lines, you know, could invoke a federal law. But in this case, I don't see that. Federal homicides are usually confined to certain areas like racketeering, particularly the mafia or drug gangs and cartels. And things like that. In this case, there's no reason to present it federally. There wouldn't be any benefit, I don't think, and I don't think it's you know, you'd have to find which federal act or which federal law it violates. But this is a local homicide. This is by its nature, a very local homicide case, and I think it belongs in the state court.
Yeah, I would think so too. As far as, you know, crossing over state lines doesn't really fit with this type of case, since it is, you know, a homicide case in state court. I will throw this one to you, Joseph. Have they found the knife, and how important is it that they find the murder weapon in this case? This comes from Diane Zantana on YouTube.
Hey, Diana. No, to the best of my knowledge, they haven't. I think the thing I've been curious about all along, because they were very specific with their descriptors about the weapon, the alleged weapon that was used in this case, and they've used terms to describe it as military style, hunting style. There was even Rambo floating around. K-Bar is a specific brand, but those fit a specific weapon profile. The term large knife has been used as well. My question, I don't think they have the weapon. However, how did they arrive at that conclusion? There's been a lot of stuff floating around the internet relative to the news media going in to interview shop owners saying, was this type of knife purchased there? I don't know that anybody's been able to confirm that necessarily. So that brings us back to more of a fact-based crime scene investigation. Was most of these knives have a sheath? Was it dropped at the scene? And I think that's a very basic question. It certainly needs to be asked. We'll find out if that is the case, but that would certainly be a tie back. I think the weapon is going to be important as far as connectivity to the alleged perpetrator and these injuries. The injuries will have been very well documented. I could do a deep dive on the injuries alone, maybe another time. But again, I go back to this vehicle. The vehicle is going to be very important as well because it's a conveyance. It's a conveyance relative to these events, perhaps. We don't know all of the details yet, but we do know that he drove around in that vehicle. And they were looking for a similar vehicle that night. So I think that's a big piece to this.
And I think that's a big piece as well. And I kind of have a question for Bobby Chacon about that. I would assume that the FBI would be involved in processing that vehicle. There have been rumors that there was a cleanup job performed on that vehicle. We don't have that confirmed. The FBI, though, if they are processing this vehicle, how easily can they find things, even if something had been cleaned up?
Well, I mean, they can. In fact, when I used to work on a forensic team in the FBI, the evidence response team, I ran the underwater portion of it. But my colleagues on the dry land portion of it, we shared a warehouse. And on their side of the warehouse, they had vehicle lifts because they did so many processing of vehicles, the kind of lift you'd see in a mechanic's garage. And they would process so many vehicles that they actually had a lift. And they would lift that vehicle, go under it and over it. Sometimes they try to clean it. Sometimes you get evidence of cleaning, and that could be actually a consciousness of guilt later if you have a crime scene specialist come in and testify that clearly there were attempts made to clean this with bleach or whatever. But they still can fight through that. It takes a lot, particularly like the doc described. If he had a lot of blood on him when he got in that car, that blood would get everywhere in nooks and crannies. And it's really hard to completely sanitize a vehicle like that if you get in there with that amount of blood on you. So hopefully that's the case. And it's not easy, but they certainly have the ability to get to that evidence in that car, even after attempts have been made to clean it.
Yeah, Anjanette, one more point.
And here's a question. Oh, sure.
Yeah, to Bobby's point, I think people might be interested in this as well. There's actually a device that's called an MVAC, which is, just imagine a miniature vacuum cleaner that squirts water or fluid into an area, and then it's sucked back up. And it can extract at a deep strata whatever's contained in there, okay? And then it goes into a holding tank, and you change these filters out, for every time you utilize this thing. And it's amazing how deep they can get in these environments. People talk about deep cleanings, and this thing goes deep. It accounts for all of that. So that's a big. We've taken leaps and bounds. We've jumped ahead in the recovery of evidence. I think that there will be something left behind. There's a lot of things we do unconsciously in a car when we're mounting up to go somewhere. I'd like everybody that's listening and watching this, think about this the next time you get inside of your vehicle. Think about all the points of contact you have on your vehicle, from lifting the handle to handling the keys to using the gear lever to the steering wheel, adjusting mirrors, all of these things that you do unconsciously. These are things that he may not have considered, not to mention those things that he passively left behind. So to Bobby's point, they get that thing in a lab, they're going to tear it apart. They'll take the seats out of it. They'll go down to the substrata in this vehicle.
And also probably use, I'm assuming, a black light or something like that that will show not only blood residue that maybe was cleaned up, but it shows a lot of things, actually. A lot of things will appear under a black light, but they could find some evidence that way as well. We're getting up to more of your questions. Keep them coming on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube, and we will get to them, as many of them as we can. We have a lot of them coming in. I'm going to go to this next one, this next question, a person asking, and some of this is speculation, and we know the answers to some of these questions. This one comes from Zoe Who. I just want to know how he killed all 4 victims and nobody heard anything. None of them fought back. That's where I'm lost, in my opinion. But that's not exactly true. We do know that some of them had defensive wounds, and we don't know that anybody didn't hear anything. So, Joseph, I guess I'll ask you about that. Is it possible that there's a violent crime like this where roommates down below maybe don't hear anything?
Yeah, not having visited the residence, and I can only take it on faith what former residents of the same location are saying. I think some people had stated that they could be in the basement and there'd be a radio stereo turned up having a party upstairs and they couldn't hear it. Maybe that's the case. I'm not an acoustic specialist, but I think that we do have evidence of an awareness. Anytime you have defensive wounds, that goes to an awareness that you are in fact being attacked. You're trying at a primal level. You're trying to fend things off. You're blocking and all these sorts of things. And right, you are, Anjanette. They have said that at least, well, more than one, I think now, of these poor kids had defensive injuries on them. So that goes to awareness. So I don't think that this was done with the great stealth that some people might think it was.
And Jeanette, if I could add to that too, I mean, the
Yes.
questioner says something that I've heard over and over again, that the other 2 surviving housemates didn't hear anything. We don't know that for a fact. We haven't seen their statements to police. I lived in college in a similar house like this with a bunch of people, and if I was out drinking and I lived down on the lower floor and I heard commotion upstairs, 2 or 3 hours after I had fallen asleep, and it kind of woke me up, I would pull the pillow over my head and curse my housemates and say, why, because they would often come home later than I did, and they would often bump into furniture, so we don't know that they didn't hear anything. They could have heard something and chalked it up to, a group of friends coming back with their housemates and continuing the party upstairs or whatever, and they might have just, gone back to sleep. I mean, one of those 2 remaining housemates might have even, seen this guy leaving the house and chalked and not know the murders happened. And so we don't know what they said. So I don't think it's a good assumption to think that they just slept through that whole attack.
And I think you make an excellent point there. I think a lot of people think they know things from what they've read on the internet and things like that. And we are committed to bringing you just the facts that we've been able to verify. And we have no idea if these roommates heard anything or not. And I do want to mention as well, I spoke to a neighbor who lived across the street from that house, and he told me it wasn't unusual to hear noises in that neighborhood on that street. Weeknights, weekend nights, if somebody had screamed, if anybody had made a noise, you wouldn't think anything of it because kids are partying and things like that. So I think we need to really keep it to just the facts here, and maybe not make assumptions about what somebody may have heard or seen or something like that. So we just don't know. We will hopefully learn more about that as the case progresses. We are continuing to take your questions. Keep them coming on all of our social media platforms. We will take a quick break. Stay with us. You are watching The Lunch Show here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back. I'm Anjanette Levy coming to you live from Moscow, Idaho. This is where those 4 University of Idaho students were killed tragically on November 13th of last year. A suspect now in custody in Pennsylvania. His name is Bryan Kohberger. He's 28 years old, and he will appear in court in Pennsylvania later today, where he is expected to waive extradition. So he will be brought back here to Idaho to face 4 first-degree murder charges and a felony burglary count for the murders of Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chafin. We are taking your questions, so keep them coming on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube. We will get to them, as many of them as we can. This one comes from Monique. Have Bryan's professors come forward sharing their thoughts? And I think this is from YouTube. Monique, we've only seen one of them say anything. And she is a professor from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. She talked to the Daily Mail over the weekend. Her name's Michelle Bolger. She said he was a brilliant student, one of the most brilliant she had ever had. And she was very shocked by all of this. So that's that question answered for you. Mega Truth, I'm going to toss this question to you, Joseph. Joseph Scott Morgan's a forensic death investigator with us. Bobby Chacon, a retired FBI agent and also an attorney, is with us as well. But this comes from Mega Truth, Joseph, and maybe Bobby can chime in on this as well. Just arriving, so the Elantra will be processed in Pennsylvania and not Idaho. Joseph, what are your thoughts on that? Will it be processed in Pennsylvania, or will they put that thing on a vehicle in a trailer and bring it back here to process?
From a practicality standpoint, I wouldn't move it any further than I had to. I think it would be in their best interest to probably do it locally, have the FBI do it for them. They have fine facilities all over the country. They certainly have some up in that corridor of the country, and great teams that handle forensics for the FBI. And the problem is, if you try to transfer that vehicle from any location to another, there's potential for something to be lost. And certainly, I don't think the investigators involved in this case would want that. And, they're perfectly capable of doing that. And listen, the feds come in and testify in local crimes all the time. So I think that would be a much better idea.
Bobby, I want to ask you about that as well. Do you think that the FBI would be in charge of processing this vehicle? We know, Moscow PD, they're in charge of this. This is their case. The FBI and Idaho State Police are assisting. But do you think the FBI would kind of take the lead on processing that vehicle?
Well, the FBI would certainly offer assistance in doing that. They working as partners with Moscow PD and the Idaho State Police on this. So they would say, hey, look, we have the resources if you want. Look, every FBI field office, and there are 59 of them in the U.S., or 56 of them in the U.S., has an evidence response team. They are our forensic CSI people, and they are trained all the time the same way. So the same way an FBI team in California does it is the same way an FBI team in Pennsylvania would do it. We're all trained the same way at Quantico. We go back for specialized and advanced training all the time. And so, yeah, I think the FBI would offer that. And like Doc says, every time you move it, there's an increased risk of something happening. God forbid, say the truck got into an accident, you put it on a flatbed and you seal it and you bring it, and then that gets into an accident on a snowy road crossing, the northern plains in the middle of winter. And so, and you give the defense counsel, ultimately more fodder for throwing, doubt into whether this was processed correctly. So I think, Doc is the perfect expert in this. The more you can keep it stable and where you found it and process it there, the closest facility that you have to there probably is the best way to process it, as long as that team, and certainly the FBI team in Pennsylvania, would have the training and capabilities of doing that.
Our next question comes from Kathy on YouTube, I believe. And Joseph, I'm going to ask you this question. I know you don't know the answer to it, but I'm going to add to Kathy's question. Kathy asks, have they found his shoes and clothes he wore during the murder? I know we don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to tag on and ask you, Joseph. Say clothing was still available, the clothing and shoes. That could be a treasure trove of evidence. Talk to me about, in a crime such as this, with as little as we actually know about what went on inside the crime scene, we know it was stabbing. What kind of evidence could shoes and clothing contain?
Yeah, it would be the motherload of evidence. I don't know if they found them. I know they're looking for them, though. I can guarantee you that when they executed that warrant over in Pullman, that was probably one of the things that they were digging around in there for. And listen, they took everything that they could out of there. But to clothing specifically, it is a wealth because clothing many times can act almost like a sponge, particularly when you've got a lot of biological evidence. It'll just latch on. You might not even be aware that this is occurring, you being the perpetrator. So you can just gently brush up against something and it's going to capture it and take it away. But here's the important part, and really kind of latch onto this as well, because this is just as important, is whatever clothing you're wearing into this environment, and this includes your shoes too, whatever you're introducing into that environment, going back to my old buddy LaCard again, you're going to leave a trace of that clothing there too, potentially. This is a very intimate event. People need to wrap their minds around that. When you talk about this contact that he had with these poor victims, he's fully clothed. That's an assumption. But if he is fully clothed, he's making contact with them. We've got two couples. They're co-sleeping. I think that logic would lead us to believe, and we don't know a lot about the dynamics, but let's just throw it out there as a perhaps if the perpetrator got into the bed. There's a very intimate environment here. So you can leave trace fibers on there and anything that you brought into the house with you. If he brought soil in from Pullman, Washington, the soil over there might be a bit different, than if you roll up into Moscow, Idaho. I don't know what the environment was like. Maybe they were working around his apartment. There's concrete dust around there or something that's a unique identifier. So clothing could play a big part. I think right now they're just, if they have it, I'm not aware of it. Hopefully they do, because this is going to tell the tale.
It certainly would if it's still available, if those items are still around. And who knows, maybe they're in a landfill somewhere. Searching landfills, I've covered cases where they can tell where someone's trash was dumped. They keep track of that stuff. I don't know if people realize that, but landfills do. This next question is coming from at Justin_Waken. Will the public have access to the discovery, police interviews, jailhouse phone calls, etc., pre-trial? And this is from Twitter. Bobby, that question is for you.
Well, normally no, unless the defense turns it out over to the public. I mean, there's no good reason for the prosecution to make any of that public. During the discovery process is when the government has to provide the defense with basically all the evidence that it's going to present at trial. Then the defense can, go to lengths to try to test that evidence and challenge that evidence either in pretrial hearings or by using experts to introduce at trial. So generally no, but once something is turned over to defense, unless the judge has an order in place, the defense can do with it what it wants. It will oftentimes contract with experts, and so now you have an expert that's going to know, and the expert has a facility or a team around them that's going to know. So the word will get out, but by and large, the prosecution will not let any of that out. There's no public interest in allowing that. The only objective of the prosecution right now is to obtain a conviction of this defendant for these charges. And so they don't owe the public anything else but that. That's what we're paid to do. We're paid to get that person convicted if they're the ones that committed the crime. So I don't think the public interest in this case, outweighs the objective of the prosecution in getting a conviction. Of course, as stuff is turned over to defense, like I said, the defense could leak that out or could make it public, but it shouldn't, and probably won't come from the prosecution.
Yeah, most certainly. There are ethical rules about that. Plus, the discovery in this case is going to be so voluminous. I don't know if people realize, but there was so much video evidence produced. It will probably be terabytes and terabytes of evidence that are turned over from the prosecution to the defense in this case. 300 interviews. You have to know all of those were recorded in some fashion. So it's going to be a lot of evidence, and it doesn't help anybody or help the justice system at all if any of that is leaked out. All right, we are going to take a quick break. Keep your questions coming. I'm Anjanette Levy coming to you live from Moscow, Idaho, and you are watching Law and Crime. Welcome back to the Lunch Show here on Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy, and I'm coming to you live from Moscow, Idaho. I'm actually at the Moscow Police Department, and the police officers here, along with the Idaho State Police and FBI agents, investigated the murders of those 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Gonsalves, Maddie Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. And now they have taken a suspect into custody. He's 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student at Washington State University, a short distance away from here, just across the state line in Pullman. And he is going to be in court later today, where he's expected to waive extradition. We've been taking your questions this hour, so keep them coming on social media. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And Bobby Chacon, I'm going to send this first question to you, pulling it up on my phone. One of our viewers had a question asking about what we can expect in the probable cause affidavit. This comes from @BLM Protest News on Twitter.
Well, what you'll have in there is you'll have the minimum amount. Well, some prosecutors like to keep a minimal amount. Some prosecutors like to use a little more in there. So the affidavit only had to establish probable cause that this person did these crimes, not the threshold that we'll see at trial, which is obviously beyond a reasonable doubt that everybody knows about. So I think at the very minimum, you're going to see 2 things, I think. DNA, his DNA at the scene, and how we matched it, how we know this defendant's DNA was that DNA that we found at the scene. Of course, at the scene, when we processed that profile DNA, we didn't know who it was. So how we made the match to this defendant, was it through a genealogy website or whatever, I think you'll have that in there. And I think then you'll have the second piece I think you'll have is location data, which means I think they might have some kind of cell phone pinging data, some kind of thing that put his cell phone in the area of that house at the night of the murder, or in the vicinity of these victims in the time leading up to the murder, something like that. I think you'll have physical evidence from the crime scene in there, and then some kind of location data also. You might have more than that, but at a minimum, I would expect those 2 types or categories of evidence presented in that affidavit.
And just a reminder of viewers, that's a really low bar, probable cause. You just have to get over that really low hurdle to get that complaint filed and everything like that. But there may be a lot of good information in that affidavit. We're all looking forward to seeing it. We don't have much time left, but Joseph, I've got a question for you coming from a fellow Alabaman from Roll Tide Mom. For Joseph, please explain how experts discover evidence not clearly visible in a perfectly clean car. Thanks! !
Yeah, you mentioned alternative lighting sources earlier. We can use infrared, those sorts of things in that environment. Another source, obviously, is if we can apply some kind of luminescence. You've all heard of luminol. We also use a product called Blue Star, which they're kind of the same, but not exactly. So even if a deep cleaning has been done, that can certainly happen. And keep in mind, they're also going to be looking for any kind of latent prints that might be there as well. Of course, you would expect to find his, but when you go onto the scene, if he took those gloves off as well, there might be latent prints that are within the scene that are tiebacks to him. This is beyond just the DNA, and so you can do all kinds of things in that environment. I'm thinking about super gluing and also iodine. We apply a solution of iodine as well to raise latent prints as well. So there's any number of methodologies that can be employed.
Well, Joseph Scott Morgan and Bobby Chacon, thanks so much for being with us. We are out of time for this hour, and thank you for joining us as well. We will see you back here later today. I'm Anjanette Levy, and you have been watching The Lunch Show here on Law and Crime. Stay tuned for more coverage on the arrest of Bryan Kohberger.
Welcome and Happy New Year to everybody. My name is Bob Bianchi. I'll be taking it for the next hour, and we're going to be taking viewer questions with regard to Law&Crime Network special coverage of the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, 28 years old, out of Idaho. As you all know, a very extensive investigation that went on for a significant period of time, a number of weeks. A lot of people criticizing that law enforcement wasn't acting fast enough, but is that true when you have a case that has 19,000 leads, as well as over 20,000 cars, I believe it is, that they had to try to narrow down through the use of DNA, lots of data coming in. I could tell you firsthand as a homicide prosecutor, all that kind of information is very difficult to put together. We're going to break it down with our tremendous guests and our on-site reporters with respect to this case. But first, let's take a quick look at Sierra Gillespie's breakdown of what this case is about, and we'll be talking to you about it on the other end.
The suspected University of Idaho murderer will appear in front of a judge and the world today in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. Suspect 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger will appear this afternoon for an extradition hearing. As Law&Crime Network reported, Kohberger was arrested in the early morning hours of Friday at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. That's not far from where we are here in Monroe County, but more recently, Kohberger was a PhD candidate at Washington State University. His apartment there in Washington State is not a far drive from the University of Idaho, or the off-campus home where 4 students were found brutally stabbed to death back in November. For weeks, we had little information about that case. No leads, no suspects, and really no information except that investigators were searching for a white Hyundai Elantra. We can now confirm that a white Elantra was seized during the investigation at Kohberger's parents' house. Speaking of Kohberger's parents, we're also learning that Kohberger's father recently flew from Pennsylvania over to Washington to drive with his son cross-country back here to the East Coast. During that more than 2,000-mile road trip, Kohberger's father said he didn't notice anything suspicious or off about his son. Kohberger's family, though, has since released a statement saying they send their remorse to the family members of the victims and that they're hoping this can play out in the legal system. As for Kohberger's public defender, he says his client hopes to soon be exonerated and that he is not fighting extradition. He also reminds the public that Kohberger is innocent until proven guilty and that this should not be tried in the court of public opinion. So what can we expect from this extradition hearing this afternoon? Kohberger will appear in front of a judge at about 3:30, and the hearing isn't expected to be very long. He isn't fighting the extradition, meaning he could be back in Idaho as early as this evening. After that, Kohberger will appear in front of a Latah County judge, and it's then that a now sealed affidavit will likely be unsealed. Then we will likely learn more information about the investigation and what led up to Kohberger's arrest. For now, though, we will continue to follow this ever-developing case, bringing you the latest details as they unfold. Reporting in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, Sierra Gillespie, Law&Crime Network.
All right, Sierra, thank you so much. So I have Richard Schoenstein with me. He is a litigator. And Richard, love having you on set in studio, always giving us great information. Richard, the thing from having this experience is that data management is a huge issue. You've got detectives and investigators that are going out and canvassing. You got investigators doing forensic evidence. You got investigators that are trying to piece it all together on so many different levels. And sometimes one hand may not know what the other hand is doing. We have a question from one of our viewers, Oliver Hartburn, who asks, but what can we expect when this probable cause affidavit is eventually released, understanding that under Idaho law, they're not allowed to release it until a defendant is on Idaho soil? Thoughts?
Happy New Year is my first thought, and it's good to be here with you too. This is a really interesting situation. So the probable cause affidavit will probably be released relatively soon. I understand he's going to waive extradition. He's going to be returned to Idaho. So we'll probably see the affidavit then. I don't think it's going to say a lot. Remember, it's a probable cause affidavit. It doesn't outline every piece of evidence that the prosecution has. It's not like trying to prove your case at trial. It's not an opening statement. It's just an affidavit setting forth that there's probable cause to connect this suspect to the murders to arrest him. So it's going to have some basic facts, but it's not going to have the whole story.
Okay, I want to play point-counterpoint with you, having been a person that's literally been there having to prepare this in a circumstance like this. We have a high-profile case. Yeah. You are 1,000% correct. Typically, prosecutors want to keep it short, sweet, and only to the very basics for an extradition hearing. but also in certain cases they may want to put more detail in there in order to inform the public at the same time. But they always have that careful balance to make sure that they don't put information in there that could taint potential other witnesses down the road. And I think we're going to find this in this case. There may be, I suspect, something where the defendant may have been communicating on social media certain things to certain individuals as a sleuth trying to figure the case out, but had information that only the person who was the perpetrator would have known because law enforcement didn't release the information. So it is a nuanced thing that they have to do here.
Yeah, it is a nuance. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, right? You said that the investigation has been criticized for taking too long, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't matter how long it takes. Get it right, get the right person, get a conviction. And you had a ton of evidence. It wasn't somebody apparently who had an obvious connection to the victims and jumped off the chart as a suspect. So it took some sleuthing. Yeah. You have that factor. But there is public concern. There's nationwide public attention. There's this whole army of internet sleuths that have been on this case for day one trying to piece it together. So you have to take all of that into consideration. You might put things in the probable cause affidavit if you think they will help elicit more evidence by being disclosed publicly. So things that might lead those internet sleuths to come up with things that would come back to the investigation and help the prosecution. I could see that being in there, but I still don't think it's going to be every detail of the evidence.
Okay, let's take one more here from Real Madrid 05, and the question is there any indication of motive yet? Any indication that he has done this before? That was from Twitter. Anything that we know right now, other than he was seemingly fascinated about the minds of criminal defendants when he was in that course where he was asking those questions in a survey.
I mean, I don't want to guess ahead of the prosecution too much, but unfortunately, it almost seems like a murder for sport case. It almost seems like somebody who was fascinated about killing and wanted to go out and do one. That studied murder at a couple different places with prominent people and then went out and did this. I haven't heard anything yet that shows a personal motive connected to any of the victims. I know they're still looking at that, but I haven't heard about any of that. There's no apparent financial motive or any that makes any sense whatsoever. Yeah. So it sounds like crime for sport.
You know, and there is some indications by the sleuths on social media, and I've been reading it. This is unverified, it's unofficial, but indicating that there may have been a relationship on social media, at least with one of the victims. We don't know if that's true or it's not. And I can tell you firsthand, I've watched people report on cases that went on social media and then all of a sudden it became a fact when it was contrary to the proof, so we don't know. But I want to pick up on Real Madrid 05's further question about extradition hearings. Do you expect that he'll waive extradition to transport himself back to Idaho to face murder charges for the deaths of the University of Idaho students? Is it surprising is the question, and can I ask you one other question? Is it surprising, but also, do we expect this could be the kind of guy, as we're learning about him, that's going to want to be the center of attention, and since he's so smart and wants to show everybody so smart as a criminologist, may represent himself in the case?
Right, so we always have this problem in this kind of case. You may have a defendant who wants to be famous. That might be his ultimate goal here, is to be really famous. And maybe that's part of his play here, to be at the center of a trial that's going to be covered here and going to be covered all over the media. Maybe that's what he wants. Maybe that's what he's doing. I don't know. I'm not surprised he's waiving extradition and going back to Idaho. I don't know if he had any benefits from staying in Pennsylvania and fighting that process. It was probably inevitable anyway. So yeah. I wasn't surprised to hear that that's what's happening.
Yeah, just so the audience knows, I mean, waiving extradition is usually what's done because doing the extradition proceeding, it saves some time, but ultimately he's going to wind up back in Idaho. The only advantage the defense could possibly get is maybe a little bit more information in the extradition hearing, but this lawyer in Pennsylvania that now represents him isn't going to be representing him in Idaho, so they're probably like, just get over there, because we're told by the lawyer he wants to start getting to his defense as quickly as possible. That would be accomplished if he waives extradition. Time for a quick break. We'll be back with more on the other end. Please stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Bob Bianchi. Our coverage continues in the fatal stabbing of 4 University of Idaho students. 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody by Pennsylvania authorities on Friday and was arraigned later that day. Now, again, this case happened in Idaho, so he is expected to appear in court today for an extradition hearing, the government asking that he be taken from the state of Pennsylvania and be brought, even against his will, if that's the way it has to be, to the state of Idaho to answer those charges. But let's take a look and a listen right now from Friday's press conference where Idaho Police Chief and Latah County Prosecutor announced his arrest.
To recap this case, on the evening of November 12th, Kaylee and Madison arrived home at about 1:56 a.m. after visiting a local bar and street food vendor. Ethan and Xana were at the Sigma Chi house before arriving home around 1:45 a.m. The 2 surviving roommates had also been in the community but returned around 1 a.m. On the morning of November 13th, a 911 call was made at 11:58 a.m., reporting an unconscious person at the residence. The call came from inside the home from one of the surviving roommates' cell phones. Moscow police responded and found 2 victims on the 2nd floor and 2 victims on the 3rd floor. On November 17th, autopsies were conducted and the Latah County coroner confirmed the identity of the 4 victims. The cause and manner of death was homicide by stabbing. Some had defensive wounds, and each had been stabbed multiple times. These murders have shaken our community, and no arrest will ever bring back these young students. However, we do believe justice will be found through the criminal process. This was a very complex and extensive case. We had developed a clear picture over time, and we stand assured that the work is not done, but be assured the work is not done. This has just started. Since November, we have remained laser focused on pursuing every lead in our pursuit of justice for the victims and their families. I recognize the frustration with the lack of information that's been released. However, providing any details in this criminal investigation might have tainted the upcoming criminal prosecution or alerted the suspect of our progress. We will continue to provide as much information as we can as the process moves forward. Today, I want to specifically thank our dedicated Moscow Police Department detectives, patrol officers, the Idaho State detectives, the Idaho State troopers, and their crime lab technicians and scientists, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the resources and personnel to conduct this massive investigation. It was the dedication of them and the persistence and the numerous hours that led to an arrest. Fortunately, these highly skilled people worked together as a cohesive team to solve this case. I also want to thank our community and the nation. Over the past 6 weeks, I've been continually reminded of how much our community cares. Locally, public support has been exceptional with kind words, food for investigators, and letters of support. You will never know how much your words of encouragement help us through these trying times.
As far as Mr. Kohberger, I can share with you that he is a graduate student at Washington State University and has an apartment residence over at Pullman. He has had an initial appearance in front of a judge in Pennsylvania. He is being held without bond, and the warrant from our magistrate judge here also provides for no bond. We understand that he's scheduled to be back in court in Pennsylvania next Tuesday afternoon, and that a public defender has been appointed for him there. The process at this point is, since he was arrested in another state, he has the opportunity to either waive extradition and return voluntarily to the state of Idaho, or if he prefers not to waive extradition, then we will initiate extradition proceedings through our governor's office. If we do that, it can take a while for him to get here. So again, I'm asking for your patience and understand that's just the way the system works. Once he gets here, he'll have an initial appearance with our magistrate. They'll deal with issues such as making sure competent counsel is representing him, and the case will be scheduled for further hearings. Your primary source of factual information is going to be the court record, because that's what the Supreme Court says we need to refer you to. So please pay attention to what's going on in court and have people there to watch and hear what's being said. As an attorney, myself and my office, we are limited on what we are allowed by the courts to say outside of the courtroom. So please just work with us. Finally, as the chief indicated, this is not the end of this investigation. In fact, this is a new beginning. You all now know the name of the person who has been charged with these offenses. Please get that information out there. Please ask the public, anyone who knows about this individual, to come forward, call the tip line, report anything you know about him to help the investigators and eventually our office and the court system understand fully everything there is to know about not only the individual, but what happened and why.
All right, we have Marie Pereira with us, who is a criminal defense lawyer and former prosecutor. Happy New Year, Marie, to you.
Happy New Year, guys.
Okay. Hey, Marie, I want to get into this because I've kind of been really interested in the public statements that are being made by the police and the prosecutors in this case. Now, the prosecutor just said something that is really important, and that is the information you're going to get mainly is in the court record and what goes on in the courtroom. Those are the ethics rules of most places. Now, we've seen cases where people are out giving press conferences. This is a prohibited practice for prosecutors, so they've been very, very careful to follow, and I think rightly so, those rules. So what do you think about that? And let's start with that. What do you think about the idea that, look, we're not going to be able to tell you everything about the case. We can't try the case in the court of public opinion. What you're going to get is going to come from inside the courtroom. The right thing or the wrong thing, Marie?
The right thing, and I think it's very professional. I think from the outset, it's evading situations where, you know what, they're going to do what you said, try the case in the court of public opinion, which would be very unprofessional. They don't want to turn this tragedy into some salacious situation where there's press all over the place, information being leaked out that could damage the integrity of their case, and I'm sure there's an ongoing investigation. I personally was shocked that this guy was arrested, that he was such an unlikely suspect. I mean, really, a PhD candidate in criminology accused of these heinous murders.
Yeah.
He fled the scene, went to lay low in the darkness of where he went to live, and it turns out he was arrested in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
Albrightsville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
really?
And there may be evidence that he was actually kind of following along with the case and participating in trying to solve it. Maria, I want to ask you one question, criminal defense question. Having been both a prosecutor and criminal defense lawyer, I don't think the audience may understand what he meant by the extradition proceeding in the governor's warrant. And just to be clear, and I want your thoughts on this, you just can't grab somebody. One state just can't go in there. There's a process that has to get a governor's warrant. It has to usually be done by the head district attorney or county prosecutor. Explain why that is and what the process is to the best of your understanding.
The best of my understanding, it's an issue of jurisdiction. He committed this crime in Idaho. He fled to where his parents lived in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, and that's a separate jurisdiction. You cannot just physically, like you said, take a person and force them to appear before a judge in a complete different venue in another jurisdiction. He could have said, no, I'm not going. I don't think that, that motion would have been successful because it would have just been a delay tactic, but right. You just don't pick someone up from one jurisdiction and bring them to another jurisdiction to charge them with a crime without that person agreeing.
Right, or getting a judicial, a governor's warrant and judicial approval. Richard, let's go to what my biggest concern was in the beginning of this case was media management. They were kind of all over the place. And what I was really confused as a person who ran a prosecutor's office was they had both prosecutors speaking about the case and they had the local police chief sometimes contradicting themselves, and that gave me a sense of a lack of confidence, thinking that if there's multiple police agencies, sometimes they don't play well in the sandbox and there could be misinformation. And I was hoping that the media message was just one because they weren't sophisticated in media messages, and that the investigation wouldn't be that way. And it doesn't appear as if the investigation was. But can you explain to me, when I was the prosecutor, no law enforcement agency got to speak about a case, because in the end, those ethics rules that we have in the prosecutor's office apply to the police departments as well. Why wasn't there a unilateral voice here rather than many disparate voices?
I don't know. The situation absolutely called for a quarterback to,
right.
To say it that way. Somebody who was going to run this and say to the public and make whatever public statements were going to be made. And there shouldn't have been other people running around making that. And that is, to Marie's point and your point, why this concept that they're going to litigate the case in court and show their evidence in court and make their arguments in court, why that has so much merit. Because then it is just one place, one voice, it'll be consistent, and it'll be there in the court record. It really shouldn't be out in the media in 5 or 6 or 10 different voices. That has the potential for inconsistency, confusion, and other mischief.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. But hopefully, again, it was limited to the media management piece, and obviously not the investigation. Okay, guys, we got a lot more. If you have any questions, YouTube, Twitter, wherever it may be, that you'd like us to answer, please feel free to forward them to us. We'd love to answer those questions. You know I love to do that. We're going to be right back after this break. Hi, welcome back to Law&Crime Network. If you're just joining us, I'm Bob Bianchi. Our coverage is continuing in the fatal stabbing of 4 University of Idaho students. 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody by Pennsylvania police on Friday and was arraigned later that day. Now he's expected to appear in court again for an extradition hearing that he is expecting to waive. Our very own Anjanette Levy sat down with Shannon Gray, that's the attorney representing one of the victims' families. Let's listen to this as we hear what the family is doing after Kohberger's arrest, which, as you can imagine, for any family is a great victory for them, and they've waited so long for this with all the trepidation and anxiety that this case would never be solved.
Basically that the interview, it maybe wasn't basically set out the way it should have been, but it was, now that we have a name and we have a person, the family, all the families are going to be looking for connections between all of the victims. So, and if we find any connections between Kaylee or Maddie or Ethan or Xana or any of those, the victims in the case, we'll be relaying all of that information over to the Moscow Police Department. And we're going to allow the Moscow Police Department to determine if they release any information regarding those connections. And I think the Moscow Police Department is really asking from the public, now that there's a face and a name, that get as much information as you can to us about this guy, right? About his habits, things that he was doing, all that stuff, still asking for community help. You know, things have changed in some aspect of it, is that they have a person that they've arrested. But the loss of their daughter hasn't changed. The loss that she was murdered and all of those things, that hasn't changed at all. And now you have to have hope. You know, you had hope that they would get an arrest. Now you have to have hope that they're going to get a conviction, that they've done all the things that they needed to do, that they dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and they have evidence that will come in, and we'll get a good hard evidence on this individual, and you know, any additional evidence that they can, circumstantial evidence that they can find that will add to the weight of the direct evidence and the hard evidence on the case. I mean, so they're hopeful that that will happen. But it's still a long journey. I mean, we're nowhere near the end. They haven't given us any information. I've emailed them about that information, if they could give me some specifics as far as timelines, things like that. And I haven't received any response about specific timelines, on just that they don't have any information. I would suppose that if he waives extradition tomorrow, I think the hearing's supposed to be earlier than the 3:30. I think it's supposed to be an 11:30 hearing. And so I would assume that they might have someone out there that might be able to get custody of him immediately after the hearing. And then I would assume that they're going to be flying him back. I can't imagine that someone would be driving. So flying him back, and, you know, he could arrive in Idaho within 8 to 10 hours, probably of that range. And then, you know, the next day, possibly make a court appearance to get an attorney on the case. And then, you know, it kind of starts the process, and that attorney may ask for some time about some different things and for a timeline. So we'll have a better idea once he's back here, but I don't know when that's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, I think they'll be involved as they possibly can in this, you know. They still have jobs, right? They still have things they have to do to make a living, and I'll be there as much as I can, and the family will be there as much as they can, and sometimes it'll probably be Steve and Christy. Sometimes it might be Steve or just Christy, or maybe just me, or other family members that might have some availability to come down. But I'm pretty sure there will be a representative of the family at every proceeding moving forward.
Yeah, Richard, I think that this is really an important statement that was made. I like the cadence and the way that he went about it. He recognizes this is going to be a long haul. A lot of this, I've dealt with this, where the victims are going to start probably being upset about defendant's rights and preserving his due process. So he seems to be a good guy at trying to explain to them what this process is. But what was really important to me, and I've seen this be a big problem, and I hope it's not here, I suspect it won't be, is that he recognizes that it doesn't stop here. They have to continue to get with any other additional evidence they can. And that also, he alluded to eliminating defenses. This is a big thing for me right now. Prosecutors could think they have an ironclad case, but they got to think about things of the defenses of, it wasn't me, my DNA may be there, but it wasn't me, or self-defense in some circumstances, I'm not saying in this particular case, or insanity, or passion provocation. So it's not just enough to show he did it. Prosecutors want to gather all the evidence they can to rebut what they anticipate potential defenses, albeit they may be bad ones, but which ones may come forward? What are your thoughts?
Right. You've tried a lot of cases on both sides, prosecution and defense, right?
Sure.
Did you ever once have as much evidence as you wanted? Did
No.
you ever once have right? That's it. You want to get as much evidence as possible. You don't want to win by a point. You want a slam dunk prosecution case that will put this guy away. And the other thing, they might still be investigating if there's anybody else involved in this. Right, 4 people were killed. I haven't heard anybody exclude the possibility of somebody else being involved, so that might still be an open issue. But even if it is just this alleged perpetrator, you want to line up as much evidence as possible, and now you're reaching out to the families. And I do like, too, Bob, you mentioned the fact that they seem well informed. I like the fact that they have their own lawyer who's out looking for their interests, because he will help keep them informed and keep them in the pace. You're right, it's going to be a long, grueling, arduous process for them, and it's good that they have their own representation.
Yeah, and let's go, Marie. I want to go to some of these questions from our viewers. There's so many prescient ones. They're really good. I said this was the next legal move that prosecutors have to come up with or determine. Julio Lachaga, I hope I'm saying that right, who indicated or asked, is it possible they will seek the death penalty in this case? Marie, thoughts?
I don't think so. I mean, it is a heinous crime. But I think it's too early to say anything about the death penalty. It depends on the defenses. There's so much to unpack, and there's a mountain of evidence. Although the arrest is a good step, but from arrest to trial to conviction, a lot more information has to come out before we can talk about the death penalty in this case.
Okay, and these questions are coming from Facebook. Richard, I want to bounce another one with you. Barbara North asked a question which I think kind of loops into this. Is there speculation or investigation of possible stalking of one or more of the victims? I'm sorry, this was from YouTube. Now, I have seen that. It's not official, but I think that this is an important factor, because if I were assessing a death penalty case, you're looking at aggravating and mitigating factors. 4 bodies, that's a big aggravating factor, but during the commission of a felony, that's going to be an aggravating factor. But I think if I were the prosecutor, and I was one who made these calls, if I heard this person was stalking these people for a considerable period of time, that goes to premeditation, it goes to cold, calculated murder, and all those defenses that I mentioned before, self-defense, insanity, passion provocation, I know are all thrown out the door. That would push me towards the death penalty piece of this. What are your thoughts?
I think it would push me in that direction too, and it's important to the case, right? As we were saying, to get all the evidence possible. What is the motive here? So we're hearing a possible motive that this is just somebody who is doing crime for sport or something like that. That's almost hard to imagine. For you and me to imagine somebody. It seems if you can show a personal connection, that would be easier, I would think, to show to a jury. And you certainly want to explore that if it's true. But I don't know. I've heard the speculation too. I saw a lot of speculation on the internet about this case, and I don't know how much of it is true and how much isn't.
Yeah, we just got to get those facts. But, you know, a lot of times when you're evaluating a death penalty case as a prosecutor, you're asking yourself, if not this case, then what case? And certainly looking at those aggravating factors, there's, I think, going to be plenty here. Okay, from Facebook, we have a question. I believe it's J.D. Zen or Claire, who wrote, he has a public defender. I wonder if there will be a firing moment and he represents himself. And I want to go to Pepe. Again, I apologize if I missed these tags or these titles. How important is it to find the murder weapon? Marie, let's talk about both of those things. Finding the murder weapon. Let's talk a little bit about motive, too. So finding a murder weapon, motive. And so far from what we're reading anecdotally, is this the kind of guy that may say, I want to be the hit star of the show. I'm going to represent myself. I'm a criminologist.
It could definitely happen. He's getting his PhD in criminology. He could want to do a Darrell Brooks, maybe do a better job than Darrell did and represent himself. He has the right to do it. And if he proves that he's competent and the court approves it after examining his mental state, it could well be that he represents himself. We don't know what's going to unfold here.
Okay, Maria, I'm going to go back to you with this one more from War Eagle Jack. That one I can pronounce, and he asks a very pragmatic question. Will PA cops be responsible for flying him back to Idaho if he waives extradition? How does that work? I don't know if it's universal. Maybe you know, Maria, but at least in my jurisdiction, we went and grabbed the guy and brought him back. But what are your thoughts?
When I was in the Bronx DA's office, we went and grabbed our people and brought them back. I think it could be sort of like a bilateral effort where they go to pick up their suspect and the people in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania cooperate and make the process very smooth from beginning to end.
Yeah, I got to tell you guys a funny anecdotal story real quick. We were picking a guy up from Washington State on the run for weeks, and we couldn't find him. No electronic data. He went dark. He was off the grid. When we finally got him from a crazy tip, we had our guys go out there. They read him his Miranda rights. He started talking, and from the plane ride from Washington to New Jersey, I had a lieutenant text me, I can't shut this guy up. He actually wanted to stop the guy from talking. The point is, though, some of them may talk along the way, and having an investigator who actually is on the case in Idaho listening to that could be a very important factor as to why they may want to pick him up. All right, guys, lots of interesting analysis here, lots more to go. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, Bryan Kohberger, we're waiting for the extradition hearing to see whether or not he is going to be taken from Pennsylvania to Idaho to answer for those 4 gruesome and brutal murders. While we're doing that, our audience is bringing in your questions. We want to hear what you have to say. We've got a lot coming in. Richard, I'm going to start with you. I got two here. One is from Dino Spumanti. They're kind of similar. The question is he being charged with capital murder or just first-degree murder? But first, the Coffees asked the question, how many years do y'all, did I do that right? Because I'm a northern guy. Do y'all think he will get?
I don't know if you did that right or not, but it sounded good to me. I don't know exactly what the charge is going to be. I don't think we've seen exactly what the charges are out of Idaho, if it's called capital murder or first-degree murder. But the second question sort of gets more to the point. If he is guilty, if he is found guilty of going into an apartment building and stabbing and murdering 4 college students, he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail, or maybe he's going to get the death penalty. Those would seem to be the only 2 options to me. I don't see, if he is really guilty of what's being suggested, I don't see him ever being out of prison.
Okay, so Marie, wow, we got some really great questions here. Herbert Arnold is asking, aren't they going to need either blood under somebody's fingernails or blood in the car to connect him to the murder? Let's answer that one quick, because I've got a couple more good ones.
They're not going to need that exactly. It could be a circumstantial case where they have little bits of very credible evidence that lead to him committing the crime. Yes, DNA evidence would help, but it's not a mandatory situation. There are other ways where they can prove he committed this crime through forensics, phone records, and other circumstantial type evidence.
Okay, agreed. A Valiant Pixel asked Richard, has there ever been a case where a suspect was arrested with this level of certainty but turned out to be the incorrect person?
So I'm going to challenge this level of certainty, and I want to remind everybody watching, this is somebody who's being accused of committing murder. We have a system here, and we have to let the system play out. We have to get formal charges and a complaint by the prosecution. We have to have the discovery process, and he gets a trial. So I don't believe there's a level of certainty until and unless a jury convicts him. That's how I believe the process works.
Yeah, and listen, that is so true. We've all been around the block, and this is where prosecutors make a mistake. You always have to keep an open mind, because I have been there where they were absolutely certain it was suspect A, and it turned out to be somebody completely different. So mistakes do happen, and the case has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But let's see, let's move on. Marie, interesting question. So do you think he snapped or planned this, and is the guy on suicidal watch?
We don't know if he's in suicidal watch. If he was, I'm sure we would have heard it. I don't think so. I think he's anxious to come back to Idaho in order to clear his name. Based on what I'm hearing, it's not like, a slam dunk where he's confessing to what he's being accused of. And I agree wholeheartedly with Rich. We don't know what the facts are. So we cannot jump the gun and say this man is guilty. There is a presumption of innocence, and they haven't even unpacked all the evidence they had against him, because it's against the law in Pennsylvania. So we really don't know. I agree with Rich.
Right. Okay, well, Little Miss KX, I want to answer your question for you. Do you think he snapped or planned this? This is what we were referring to before, that if there is evidence, and there's some suggestion anecdotally, it's not official, that his phone was pinging around these victims for a considerable time, days before the murder. This is what prosecutors want to say. This isn't passion provocation. This isn't somebody snapping. This is someone that's literally going out plotting premeditatedly and executing the person. And of course, in order for the defense to win a lower charge, a passion provocation or something of that nature, in other words, he snapped, it's got to be a reasonable provocation. He, in fact, had to be provoked, and he had no opportunity to cool off. Those are the general factors for passion provocation. And in these instances, I don't know if that's going to be easy for the defense to show, but we'll have to wait for the affidavit to see this. Marie, real quick, go back to you, or I think it's you, Richard, at this point in time. So Stereophonic's mom asked a question we kind of alluded to before. Question, chances of him going pro se, representing himself?
Oh, I don't think I can watch that again. I mean, we sat through 2 of those pro se trials last year.
I love them.
Oh, it's brutal. It's brutal. I mean, sure, people seem to be doing it. And let me just say, as I've said in this chair several times, it is a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea to represent yourself at trial, even if you're a lawyer, even if you're a PhD student, even if you're the smartest guy in the world, you need a lawyer. It would be miserable, and I would not look forward to watching it.
You know what? You just used the smartest guy in the room, and that is what I have seen in my career with those very high-end, intellectual, well-educated people that give statements and want to represent themselves because they think they're the smartest guy in the room, not realizing they stitched themselves into a conviction many times. Marie, let's move to you for Crypto Man 5000. The question is, shouldn't this case be presented to a federal grand jury? He crossed state lines. I have some strong views on this, but I'm interested in yours first.
I don't think that it will, and if it will, it's going to come after the state case, because you can be tried in state case, in state court, I mean, and then be tried in federal court on different other federal grounds. It's not a no-no, but I think they're just going to stick with the state.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that state line crossing is going to have to do actually with the substantive crime as opposed to fleeing that crime. That's number one. But state prosecutors are used to trying murder cases day in and day out, and those guys are really, really good at what they do. Certain fields have different specialties. Not that they're all can't do it. I would agree with you. Start with the state, and then see what other additional charges the feds had, very much like they've done with so many other cases that we've seen covered at the Law and Crime Network. All right, Richard, up to you. Judge Menta, will the dad get arrested if he helped clean the car?
Maybe. I mean, sure, if the dad helped clean a car and, for example, wiped up blood or found the murder weapon, or did something else that aided and abetted the defendant, he could get arrested. That could definitely be a further prosecution. Yeah,
I want to go with you, Marie, on this one too, because it's an important question. I mean, it could certainly be an accessory after the fact, destroying or discarding and obstructing an investigation. But the tactical question is, would they do that because they're trying to maybe potentially flip the father and to become a cooperating witness against the son? Thoughts?
Absolutely, because we're talking about somebody who's assuming he's an older man and maybe he's not going to want to take the rap for his son. But we don't want to make any assumptions. We don't even know if there was blood evidence. We don't know the evidence yet. So I think we're putting the horse before the cart and asking these questions even. I need to see what is unveiled at that hearing where they're actually opening up the complaint against him and saying, okay, this is what we have and this is what he's being charged with. Before we could even say blood evidence, we don't even know if there was blood evidence.
Right. Well, you're very prescient, Marie, because Richard, she talked about basically having the discovery, having the information, and Just Walkin' asked this question: will the public have access to discovery, police interviews, jailhouse calls, etc., pre-trial? This question came from Twitter.
Probably not. I mean, not to the full extent that the defense will, unless some of it gets leaked out. This prosecution seems to say they're going to put on their case in the court. They just don't dump out the evidence and make it all available to the public. That's not usually the way the process works. And the defense doesn't do it either. So I wouldn't think you would get the full extent of the record until trial.
Yeah, Marie, let's talk to you about that. I mean, again, the ethics rules are very clear, and I understand that they've been flouted in so many cases that we've seen, that these courts are not supposed to be releasing investigative information. Most OPA, or OPA Public Records Act, will not allow investigative information to be produced. It's usually an exception in most states, and every state's different. Idaho seems to be very tight with the information they're allowing law enforcement to get out in the public, and I believe that's why the prosecutor said, if you want to know, he was almost begging them, if you want to know data, come to court and read our publicly filed motions. And that's why some prosecutors will tend to write out and argue a lot in the courtroom, because they know they can't give that information as is suggested in the question. What do you think?
I think this is not going to be a Courtney Clinty type situation where things are being leaked before trial, left and right, like it's a circus. You can already see the seriousness of these people. They're not leaking any information. They're keeping it real professional, and this is not going to be a circus. Nothing is going to be leaked, and if it is, people are going to have to pay for it. And I don't think anyone is going to risk doing that.
Right, yeah, it never helps, Richard. If you make a mistake as a prosecutor in anything you do, you're only bringing more negativity into the case and creating appellate issues. But I want to ask you a question that Christina asked, and this is an important one in today's society. At a minimum, if we can't get the reports, we can only get the files and what's filing with the court and what they say inside the court. Christina wants to know, will cameras at least be allowed inside the Idaho court?
I don't know the rules. I don't know if this Idaho court is going to allow cameras in. I should have asked one of our producers that before we started. But I do want to say to people, I know there's this desperate urge to know all the facts right away, and people really want to know what happened, and they want to get to the bottom of it, and they want to know the story. Let the process play out. There is an important process here to accuse somebody of a crime, to bring him to trial, to bring him to justice. You will get the facts in due course. Right. Let the process work.
Right, and Marie, to that point, there's anecdotal evidence real quick that he may have gone on a podcast and said certain things that only the murderer could have known because it was never released by police. I got about 15 seconds. How important is that as to the reason why they don't release information? Got to be quick.
If in fact he made statements that will add to his motive and to show consciousness of guilt and even arrogance post-crime, they will let it be.
Guys, well, that's it for us. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for our regularly scheduled programming.